Chills. Number 9. Who Killed Cock Robin? Penned in 1744, this nonsensical poem casually introduces children to the morbid concepts of death, murder, and funeral preparations by using cute little animals and insects as examples. In the original poem, which is only 4 verses long, a sparrow calmly admits to shooting the bird known as Cock Robin with a bow and arrow. No explanation is given, just a heartless murder without a motive. Apparently, this was not enough to scare children, so roughly 3 decades later, an extended version has a fly watched with fascination as Cock Robin slowly dies from the arrow, a fish who collects his blood in a dish for who knows what, a beetle offering to sew a death shroud for Cock Robin to wear as a ghostly shade, an owl gravedigger, and all sorts of other non-human participants eagerly volunteering to perform some sort of death-related chore at the funeral. Eventually, Victorian-era illustrations were added, and that's where things take a really bizarre turn. A fly dressed in a turncoat gracefully bows towards the reader and beckons for them to embrace death. A frenzied bull rings a church bell with muscular human-like arms, and large groups of animals bawl their heads off over the anguish of losing a loved one. Their human-like expressions are disturbing. While the content is not overly gory, the subject matter is quite heavy for a children's audience, which is why Who Killed Cock Robin deserves an honorable mention on this list of grim tales. Number 8. The Monkey and the Crab. This dark tale of greed and revenge comes from ancient China. A crab grows a persimmons tree, and once the fruit grows ripe, he enlists the help of a monkey to pick them from the branches. Instead of sharing the fruit with the crab like a good monkey, however, the monkey decides instead to bludgeon the cheerful talking crab to death by hurling unripe persimmons until his head was smashed and his shell was broken in several places. You've got to love the gory specifics, especially in a children's story. At this point, the legend splits into 2 variations. In one, the crab is pregnant, which adds a whole other level of depravity to the story by essentially turning the monkey into a womanizer. In this version, the crab's young breaks free from their mother's corpse and seek revenge by peeling the monkey's eyes open and gleefully burning him to death. After this brutal execution, everyone lives happily ever after. In the second version, the crab's son comes across his father's corpse and somehow enlists the help of a bee and a living chunk of rock to deliver a torture-filled demise that ends with the crab victoriously punching the monkey's head off. With absolutely no moral whatsoever, in ancient Chinese fables, the lines between good and evil are often intentionally blurred, and this is a perfect example. Number 7. Pinocchio. Disney went to great lengths to omit the gorier parts from the original Pinocchio, written in 1883 by Italian author Carlo Collodi. For example, you might remember how the wooden boy's nose grows after lying, but do you recall when he slowly, very slowly burns his legs off while trying to dry his feet by the oven? Remember the scene where Pinocchio smashes Jimmy Cricket to death because he doesn't appreciate the nagging advice? No, of course not. In the original version of Pinocchio, however, these scenes exist. The talking cricket, as he's known as not Jiminy Cricket from Disney, is horrifically murdered by Pinocchio with blunt force. When describing how Pinocchio took a hammer from the bench and threw it with all his strength at the talking cricket, the narrator creepily addresses the audience as "my dear children." There's no mistaking it. Here, a violent murder is being explained in real time to children. The poor cricket fell from the wall, dead, according to the narrator, only to come back as a ghost later on to give more advice from beyond the grave. When the talking cricket returns, Pinocchio offers himself to be bludgeoned to death so long as his family is spared. The talking cricket has absolutely no intentions of harming anybody. But what a thought on Pinocchio's behalf. That is one emotionally disturbed puppet. Did we also mention that Pinocchio was hanged by an angry mob? And that was where the story was originally supposed to end, until the editors convinced Collodi to lighten up and write an ending that wouldn't send kids screaming into their mother's aprons. Somehow, these scenes did not make the Disney cut. Number 6. The 5 Chinese Brothers. Let's move away from insects, animals, and puppets and focus more on human acts of depravity. The 5 Chinese Brothers takes kids on a whimsical illustrated journey of prolonged murder trials and capital punishment. Learning about the death penalty is a great subject for a kid's book, right? Apparently so, according to Claire Hutchett Bishop. This is probably the only children's story to ever deliver the lines, "He was arrested, put in prison, and condemned to have his head cut off," and "All the people were assembled on the village square to witness the execution with a rosy tone." As the story implies, there were 5 Chinese brothers, each with their own special superpower that will come in handy later. One of the Chinese brothers swallows a sea so that he can fish, but he accidentally drowns a village child after he spits the sea back out. For this, he is sentenced to death. To avoid this punishment, the Chinese brothers secretly trade places with each other over and over again. The first Chinese brother goes home under the pretense of saying goodbye to his family, but he actually sends back his brother, who has an iron neck, and makes a beheading attempt impossible. They simply could not cut his head off, the narrator casually explains to a presumably all-children audience. After that, everyone was angry and they decided that he should be drowned, another exact phrase from the book. So the Chinese brother goes home to secretly trade places with a brother who can hold his breath underwater. After the mob decides he should be burned, another Chinese brother steps forward who can resist flames and suffocation. Thinking that this was all the same person all along, the mob eventually decides the Chinese brother must be innocent, and they finally leave the family alone. Number 5. Jimmy Crack Corn. Most people have happily sung the chorus of this song at least once as a child, blissfully unaware that they are actually reciting a song deeply rooted in slavery, misery, alcoholism, and possibly even murder. A full examination of the seemingly innocent lyrics revealed the narrator to be an unnamed slave who had to, among other chores, keep the flies off his master's horse whenever he went riding around on the farm. One day, as the song goes, an unmanageable swarm of flies landed on the horse, and one chanced to bite him on the thigh. According to the slave narrator, the horse threw my master in the ditch, and the master did not survive. There was a trial to determine what happened, and the verdict was the blue-tail fly. That's all well and good, but who is Jimmy? And why are there 2 of them now shucking corn together? Well, there's no they, and the song has nothing to do with corn on the cob. Jim Crack is an old expression which means cheat, and the corn the song speaks of is a reference to corny whiskey, which the narrator is drinking to happily celebrate his master's death. In other words, master is dead, time to get drunk. Some people even argue that the slave actually murders his master and is now sarcastically reciting his alibi while drinking. Either way, this light and airy folk song has had kids cheerfully singing about death and drinking alcohol for years. Number 4. Brave Mr. Buckingham. You may recognize Dorothy Cunhart's Pat the Bunny, but you most likely have not heard of the author's less celebrated work, Brave Mr. Buckingham. This is quite possibly the only time in literary history where a severed head appears on a book cover made for kids. The purpose of this book is to show that losing a tooth does not hurt. Sounds innocent enough, right? Somehow, Cunhart thought that showing a Native American named Mr. Buckingham routinely getting dismembered would be a great way to put children's minds at ease about losing a loose tooth. Throughout the story, Mr. Buckingham chops his arm off while landscaping, burns his leg off in the kitchen, gets his hand cut off by a saw, and even gets his neck run over by a car. After every accident, Mr. Buckingham proudly exclaims, "That didn't hurt." This is supposed to be reassuring, but it most likely encourages kids to be afraid of horrible household accidents that they never would have imagined otherwise. Tragedy after tragedy, the Native American relentlessly carries on until he is nothing but a smiling, decapitated head on a table at the end of the last page. For some reason, he is being fed strawberries by a little girl, and he says, "That didn't hurt," after every bite. Creepy? Yes. Reassuring for kids with a loose tooth? Not so much. Number 3. Strawwell Petter. This German children's book was translated into English by Mark Twain, author of The Adventures of Huckleberry and Finn. The title means Shock-Headed Peter, and it is a collection of short stories following helpless children as they learn not to misbehave the hard way, usually in the form of death. The story of Soup Caspar, for example, is a cautionary tale warning children to always clean their plate or else. Augustus is a young German boy who repeatedly refuses to eat the nasty soup his family ever so graciously offers him every night for dinner. The child wastes away a little more each time he refuses soup. The moral of the story is distinctly wrapped upon the final line, which abruptly reads, "And on the 5th day he was dead." Another entry, aptly named The Dreaded Story of Pauline and the Matches, follows a girl named Pauline who wants to light a match much in the same manner that she has seen her mother do plenty of times before. Predictably, she sets herself on fire. The narrator does not mince words when describing how she burns all over, everywhere, her arms and hands and eyes and nose, till she had nothing more to lose. The accompanying illustration also holds nothing back. It's literally a little girl set ablaze, screaming, flapping her arms wildly. As for Pauline's remains, no trace of her was found except for her shoes in a pile of ashes. Clearly, the writing style for these folk tales is far too brutal to be considered appropriate for any children for the modern era, but in Germany, this was an effective way to teach kids. Number 2, Krampus. Germany continues a timeless tradition of scaring its young with Krampusnacht, or Krampus Night, a grim celebration of a Christmas demon that is in every child's worst nightmare. While the rest of the world was excitedly leaving cookies for Santa as a child, German children were filled with dread at the thought of Krampus, a goat-legged hellion with curled horns, ashen skin, and a forked tongue, and a rod for beating bad kids. Whereas Santa merely denies you your favorite presents for misbehaving, the Krampus will literally destroy you. Oddly enough, both figures dispense coal to bad kids. Both also carry sacks, but Krampus has a sack full of kids to take with him, not presents to give out. If you've been bad, into the Krampus's bag you go. According to the legend, the Krampus will either drown the children or take them back with him to hell, hunting down children, beating them senseless for minor infractions, and sending them to hell for eternal punishment. It's Christmas time in Germany. Number 1, The Little Match Girl. Denmark tops the list with this morose and depressing short story published in 1845 about a nameless girl walking a busy street on New Year's Eve, trying to sell matches. Besides not being able to sell a single match to anyone who passes by, the girl has her shoes stolen by a homeless person, in case he has children one day, the narrator adds. So basically for no reason other than to be horrible. Desolate, the little girl sits down in an alley, where she grew colder and colder, and reflects on her horrible life. Are you depressed yet? It only gets worse. She could return home, but her father will beat her for not making any money. Besides, she thinks it is almost as cold in her house as it is outside. Her family is so poor, they are forced to plug cracks in the roof with straw and rags. Rather than go back to her abusive father, the girl decides to keep herself warm using the matches. She must not remember Pauline from Strawwellpetter. While keeping herself warm, she is magically able to see through a wall into someone's home. She is looking into a dining room. Suddenly, a roasted goose gets up from the table and charges at her. The narrator does not openly say it, but the girl most likely hallucinates the scene from a combination of hypothermia and starvation. Moments later, the girl is leaning against the wall, frozen to death. Her grandmother's spirit, the only person who had loved, guides her higher and higher towards heaven, which is the only solace this depressing story offers. In the meantime, however, her frozen corpse is waiting to be discovered by whoever chances upon it. End of story. Happy New Year?